The moment Irene Redmond stepped off the stagecoach in Dusty Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1878, she knew that the life she had left behind in Tennessee was gone forever, and the life waiting for her in this sun-scorched, wind-bitten town was entirely, terrifyingly unknown. She stood on the dry plank sidewalk with a single leather trunk at her feet, a carpetbag clutched in both hands, and dust already settling into the folds of her blue traveling dress. The town stretched out around her in the way that all these frontier settlements seemed to stretch, as though someone had taken a handful of buildings and scattered them carelessly across the flat Texas earth. There was a general store, a saloon with a sign that swung lazily in the warm wind, a blacksmith shop, a small church with a crooked steeple, and row upon row of sun-bleached wooden storefronts that seemed to lean against each other for support. Irene was 24 years old. She had brown hair the color of dark honey that she kept pinned carefully at the nape of her neck, and green eyes that her mother had always said were the color of spring leaves before the heat of summer burned them pale. She had grown up in a modest house outside Knoxville, the daughter of a schoolteacher and a seamstress, and she had spent her whole life being sensible, careful, and quiet. She had taught school herself for 2 years, had nearly been engaged once to a banker's son who turned out to be neither kind nor honest, and had watched the years gather around her like dust on a windowsill until her older sister Clara had made an offhand remark one evening that had changed everything. "There are men out west who advertise for wives," Clara had said, not unkindly, passing the bread at supper. "Hard-working men who need a partner, someone steady and educated." "It's not romantic, Irene, but it's a life." It had not sounded romantic when Clara said it. It had not sounded romantic when Irene had answered the advertisement placed by one George Hollies of Dusty Creek, Texas, seeking a wife who could cook, keep a house, and assist with correspondence for his livestock business. It had not sounded romantic during the 2 months of letters that followed, careful letters in which she and George had written politely about practical things, and it had definitely not sounded romantic when she had climbed aboard the first of 3 stagecoaches that had brought her here over the course of 9 days. But Irene was not here for romance. She was here because she had decided, with the quiet ferocity that lived beneath her calm surface, that she was going to build something real in this world, even if she had to do it in a place that looked like it might blow away in the next strong wind. She looked up and down the street, searching for George Hollies. He had told her he would meet her at the stage stop. There were several men lingering on the sidewalks, some watching the stagecoach with mild interest, some talking among themselves, a couple of cowboys tying their horses to the rail outside the saloon. But none of them came forward with the particular purposeful step of a man expecting his intended bride. She waited for several minutes, her chin level, her expression patient. Then a boy of perhaps 12 came running down the street, skidding to a stop in front of her with his hat nearly flying off his head. "Are you Miss Redmond?" he asked breathlessly. "The lady come to marry Mr. Hollies?" "I am," she said. The boy's face fell in a way that made her heart tighten immediately. "Ma'am, I'm real sorry to tell you this, but Mr. Hollies took sick 3 weeks ago. Fever got him. He passed on last Tuesday." Irene stood very still for a long moment. The warm Texas wind moved around her, tugging at the loose strands of her hair. She looked out at the dry street, the dusty storefronts, the endless pale sky above it all, and she took a slow, measured breath. "I see," she said. "Thank you for telling me." The boy looked at her with wide, uncertain eyes, clearly expecting tears or some form of dramatic collapse. She offered him neither. She simply turned and looked at her trunk and her carpetbag and began to calculate, as she always did when circumstances shifted beneath her feet, what the practical next step might be. The practical next step turned out to be getting her trunk moved to the only boarding house in Dusty Creek, a narrow 2-story building run by a sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Lavinia Poole, who charged $1.50 a week and asked no questions but missed nothing. Irene paid for 1 week and told herself she would figure out the rest by the end of it. That first evening she sat by the small window in her room and watched the sun go down behind the flat line of the horizon in a blaze of orange and red that was, she had to admit, the most spectacular thing she had ever seen. Tennessee had beautiful sunsets, soft and filtered through trees, but this was something else entirely. This was the whole sky on fire. She pulled out her journal and wrote one line before closing it again. George Holly's is dead and I have no plan, but the sky here is extraordinary. She decided that was enough honesty for one night. The next morning she rose early, put on her second-best dress and walked to the general store to ask about work. The owner, a round-faced man named Mr. Birch, told her he had no need of help but that the schoolhouse had been without a teacher since February, when the last one had gone back east on account of his wife's health. The town council manages the school, Mr. Birch told her. You'd want to speak to Caleb Ford. He's the one who handles those things. You can usually find him at the land office on Tuesdays. It was a Monday. Irene thanked him, bought a small loaf of bread and some cheese, and walked out into the already warm morning. She had not gotten more than 10 steps down the sidewalk when she nearly walked into a man coming around the corner of the general store leading a bay horse. She stopped. He stopped. The horse tossed its head with what seemed like editorial opinion. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing the kind of work clothes that had seen genuine use, canvas trousers, a worn flannel shirt the color of sage, boots that were dusty and broken in. He had dark hair that curled slightly at the collar, a jaw that was angular and shadowed with several days of stubble, and eyes that were an unexpected striking shade of pale gray, almost silver, the kind of eyes that seemed to catch light differently than regular eyes did. He was, she estimated, somewhere around 28 or 29. "My apologies, ma'am," he said immediately, pulling the horse back a step and touching the brim of his hat. "I wasn't watching where I was going." "Neither was I," she said honestly. "No harm done." He had a voice that was low and even, the kind of voice that didn't need to raise itself to be heard. He looked at her with what seemed like genuine curiosity, not the appraising look that some of the men in town had given her since she arrived, the kind of look that assessed and catalogued, but something more straightforward and open. "You're the woman who came in on the stage yesterday," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I am Irene Redmond, Nathan Thatcher." He held out his hand and then seemed to hesitate for a fraction of a second, as though second-guessing the propriety of it, but she shook it without hesitation. His hand was calloused and warm. "I heard about George Holly's, I'm sorry. That was a rotten thing to come to." "It was unexpected," she agreed. "But I'm managing." He looked at her for a moment in a way she couldn't quite read, and then his mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile but was close to one. "You heading anywhere in particular right now?" "I was going to walk and think," she said. "I'm told Caleb Ford isn't available until tomorrow. You're looking for work. I was a school teacher in Tennessee. Mr. Birch tells me the school here needs one." Nathan Thatcher nodded slowly. "It does. The last teacher left in a hurry, and the kids have been running more or less wild since. Not that they weren't already inclined that way." He paused. "I have a ranch about 4 miles out of town. I've got a hand's wife who looks after my place, and she's been trying to get the school sorted out for months. Mrs. Delia Crane. If you're serious about the teaching position, she might be able to help you make your case to Caleb Ford more convincingly than walking in alone." Irene studied him. He didn't seem to be offering this out of anything other than straightforward helpfulness, and she was not the kind of woman who refused practical assistance on principle. "That's kind of you," she said. "I'd appreciate the introduction." "I'll be at the land office myself tomorrow morning," he said. "I've got some boundary business with Caleb. If you want to come along, I can introduce you." She agreed. They parted ways, and she walked on down the street with the warm wind at her back, thinking that at least one person in Dusty Creek had treated her like a capable adult, and that was more than she had expected on her second day. She did not let herself notice too carefully that his eyes had been the color of winter sky. That was not the sort of thing she was here to think about. The land office was a small square building at the north end of the main street, and when Irene arrived the following morning, Nathan Thatcher was already there with a woman who turned out to be Delia Crane, a sturdy, warm-faced woman of about 40 with flour still on her apron, and an opinion about everything that she expressed without the slightest hesitation. "Lord above, we need a teacher," Delia said, taking Irene's hands in both of hers almost immediately upon introduction. "Those children are running feral. Tom Birch's youngest tried to brand the schoolhouse cat last week, an actual brand. The cat survived, but I cannot say the same for Tom's dignity." Caleb Ford turned out to be a tired-looking man in his 40s, who had been managing the school board position along with everything else, and was clearly relieved to hear that a qualified teacher had arrived more or less by accident. He asked Irene several questions about her education and experience, which she answered clearly and directly, and by the end of the meeting, he had offered her the position at $32 a month, the use of the small room behind the schoolhouse as her living quarters, and a promise that the school board would supply firewood through the winter. Irene accepted on the spot. When they walked out of the land office into the bright morning light, Delia immediately began talking about what needed to be done to make the schoolroom habitable, and Nathan walked beside Irene at an easy pace, listening to Delia's plans with what appeared to be patient and long-practiced affection. "She does this," he told Irene in a low voice, nodding toward Delia, who was several steps ahead of them. "Once she gets a project, there's no stopping her. I'd advise just agreeing with everything until she runs out of steam." "How long does that usually take?" Irene asked. He thought about it seriously. "I've never actually seen it happen, but I remain hopeful." She laughed before she could stop herself, a genuine laugh, quick and surprised. He glanced at her sideways with those silver-gray eyes, and there was something warm in them that she noticed and filed away carefully in the part of her mind where she kept things she wasn't ready to think about yet. The transition to her new quarters was accomplished by the end of the week. The room behind the schoolhouse was small but solid, with a narrow cot, a washstand, a small stove for heating, and a window that looked out onto the back of the building where two cottonwood trees grew close together, their leaves rustling in the constant wind. Irene scrubbed the floor, washed the windows, put her books on the windowsill, and decided that it would do very well. The school itself was a single long room with 8 rows of desks of varying sizes, a chalkboard that needed replacing, a globe that was 15 years out of date, and a wood stove in the corner that Mr. Birch's boy had apparently tried to cook something in, based on the residue. Irene spent 2 days cleaning, organizing, and making a list of supplies that she brought to Caleb Ford, who looked at it with the expression of a man seeing something both reasonable and expensive. "I'll see what I can do," he said. She got about half of it. She made do with the rest. The first day of school she had 11 students ranging in age from 6 to 14, all of them looking at her with the particular assessment that children reserve for new authority figures, measuring the exact depth of her resolve. She stood at the front of the room in her good green dress and looked back at them with absolute calm and said, "My name is Miss Redmond. I know that several of you were hoping I would be easy. I want to spare you the trouble of finding out otherwise. I am not. However, I am also fair, and I am interested in each of you, and if you give me your attention, I will give you mine. Do we have an agreement?" There was a long pause, and then the oldest boy, a lanky 14-year-old named Sam Woodrow, who had clearly positioned himself as the class's informal leader, said, "Yes, ma'am," with what sounded like actual respect, and the others followed. She taught them reading and arithmetic and geography and a little bit of history, and she discovered quickly that most of them were hungry for it in the way that children are hungry for things they haven't been given enough of, even if they would never have admitted it out loud. Within a week she had a routine. Within 2 weeks she had something that felt, cautiously, like belonging. Nathan Thatcher came into her life not dramatically, but gradually, the way a river reshapes a bank, so slowly you barely notice until you look up one day, and find that the whole landscape has shifted. He appeared at the school one Thursday afternoon 3 weeks after she arrived, standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands, and what looked like a 12-year-old boy beside him who had clearly been crying recently and was working hard to look as though he had not. "Miss Redmond," Nathan said, "I apologize for the interruption. This is my nephew, Billy. He's been staying with me since his parents passed last year. He's been out of school for some time, and I was wondering if you'd consider taking him on." Irene looked at the boy. He had his uncle's dark hair but a rounder, softer face, and red-rimmed eyes that he was holding very steady with effort that was almost painful to see in someone so young. "Of course," she said simply. She didn't make a fuss over it, didn't draw attention to his obvious distress or ask him any questions in front of his uncle that might embarrass him. She simply found him a desk, introduced him to Sam Woodrow, who seemed to immediately take on the role of unofficial guide, and got back to the lesson she'd been in the middle of. Before Nathan left, he paused at the door and gave her a look that held something quiet and grateful in it, and she nodded back, and neither of them needed to say anything else. Billy came to school every day after that, and he turned out to be bright and serious and kind in the way that children who have known grief sometimes are, as though loss has stripped away the superficial and left something more essential. He and Irene developed an easy rapport. He liked history particularly, and would sit after school sometimes asking her questions about places and events, until she had to gently tell him she needed to start supper. Nathan would come to collect him most evenings. He would stand outside the school door, hat in hand, and sometimes they would talk for a few minutes about Billy, about the town, about nothing in particular. He was not a man who talked for the sake of filling silence, which she appreciated, because she wasn't either. He listened when she spoke with a quality of attention that was, she found, rather disconcerting, because most people listened the way they read a letter they weren't very interested in, skimming for the main points, already thinking about the next thing. Nathan Thatcher listened like what you were saying actually mattered. She told herself she noticed this only because it was a pleasant change from the more distracted conversations she'd had in her life. She told herself it had nothing to do with the way the late afternoon light looked on his face, or the particular way he smiled when she said something that struck him as unexpectedly clever, slow and genuine, and a little surprised, as though she'd given him a gift he wasn't expecting. She told herself a great many things. The spring moved into summer. The heat in Dusty Creek was nothing like Tennessee heat, which was soft and wet and wrapped you like a warm cloth. Texas heat was direct and committed and had opinions. Irene adapted. She rose early before the worst of it, taught in the mornings when the schoolhouse was relatively bearable, and spent her afternoons preparing lessons, and, when she could manage it, reading in the thin shade of the cottonwood trees behind her quarters with a glass of water and the stubborn determination not to complain. She had become friendly with Delia Crane, who came into town twice a week and always stopped to share news and coffee at Mrs. Poole's kitchen table. Through Delia she learned more about the town, its dynamics, its history, and its people. She learned that Nathan Thatcher had been ranching in the area for 6 years, having come down from Colorado after his father died, and left him a small parcel of land that he had expanded through considerable work into a functioning cattle operation. She learned that he had been briefly engaged to a woman named Charlotte Hale several years back, who had decided against frontier life and gone back east, and that Nathan had not seemed particularly interested in pursuing anyone since. "He's not cold," Delia said carefully over her coffee mug, watching Irene's face. "He's just careful, he doesn't do things quickly." "I wasn't asking," Irene said. Delia smiled in the way that people smile when they know perfectly well you were asking, just not out loud. It was in mid-July when the thing happened that Irene later marked as the moment everything shifted, even though it didn't feel like that at the time. It felt, at the time, like an ordinary emergency, which was something she was beginning to understand was simply part of life in the West. She was in the schoolhouse on a Saturday morning, working on the following week's lessons, when she heard shouting from down the street. She went to the door and saw a crowd gathering outside the livery stable, and above the noise, she could hear a horse screaming the way horses do when they are in serious pain, a sound that cut through everything else. She walked quickly down the street. The crowd was a knot of townspeople around the stable entrance, and at the center of it was a large roan gelding that had apparently caught its leg in some piece of equipment and was badly tangled and deeply panicked, thrashing and making the situation worse with every movement. Two men were trying to calm it and not succeeding. Nathan was there. He had clearly just ridden in from somewhere, as he was still in his riding clothes and there was road dust on him, and he was at the edge of the situation assessing it with a focused, quiet intensity that was entirely different from the anxious energy of everyone else. He didn't shout. He moved to the horse's head with slow, deliberate movements and a low, continuous voice that seemed to cut through the animal's panic the way a steady light cuts through fog. He spoke to the horse quietly, his hand moving to its neck with calm assurance, and the thrashing slowed, degree by degree, until the horse was still enough for the blacksmith and another man to carefully free the tangled leg. The leg was cut but not broken. It would heal. Irene had watched the whole thing from the edge of the crowd and found that she had her hand pressed over her heart without quite remembering putting it there. The way he had moved through that situation, not with bravado or performance but with a kind of deep, practical competence, the knowledge of exactly what was needed and the steadiness to provide it, had done something to the careful arrangements she had been making inside herself. He looked up then and found her eyes across the crowd, and for a moment neither of them looked away. Then the blacksmith was thanking him and the crowd was dispersing, and the moment passed like a cloud shadow moving across the ground. Irene walked back to the schoolhouse with the particular measured step of someone who is thinking very carefully. It was Delia who finally put into plain words what was happening, the way Delia always eventually put things into plain words, during a supper at the Crane family's ranch 2 weeks later to which Irene had been invited along with several other people from town. Nathan was there too, as he usually was at any gathering at the Crane ranch, since he and Hector Crane had been friends for years. He and Irene had fallen into the easy, somewhat cautious orbit that had been developing all summer, sitting near each other at the table without quite sitting together, talking in that natural, comfortable way of two people who have found that the other's company is easy. After supper, when most of the guests had moved out onto the wide porch to enjoy the cooler evening air, Delia appeared at Irene's elbow with the expression of a woman who has been patient long enough. "He looks at you the way a man looks at something he's not sure he's allowed to want yet," Delia said quietly, watching Nathan across the porch where he was talking with Hector. "And you look at him the way a woman looks at something she's decided she isn't going to want but isn't entirely succeeding." Irene opened her mouth and closed it again. "I'm just observing," Delia said pleasantly. "You don't have to say anything." She didn't say anything, but she stood there in the warm evening air and let herself, for just a moment, stop arguing with the thing she had been arguing with since roughly the second week she had been in Dusty Creek. She was in love with Nathan Thatcher, or close enough to it that the distance was academic. The question was what to do about it, because Irene Redmond had come to Texas to build something real, not to be swept off her feet by the first man who treated her like a person, and she was going to handle this sensibly. The handling it sensibly lasted approximately 4 more days. It was an evening in late August, one of those evenings when the heat of the day finally let go and the air turned soft, and the sky went from orange to violet to deep blue with a slowness that seemed almost ceremonial. Irene was sitting outside on the small wooden bench behind the schoolhouse, her lessons done, her book open in her lap but unread, watching the color leave the sky. She heard his footsteps, unhurried and familiar, before she saw him, and then Nathan Thatcher came around the corner of the schoolhouse with his hat in his hand and something different in his expression, something that was less careful than usual. "Billy said you'd be out here," he said. "Billy's usually right about where I am," she said. "He pays attention." Nathan sat down on the ground nearby, leaning against the corner of the building, and for a moment they were both quiet in the comfortable way that they had learned to be quiet together. "I want to ask you something," he said then, and his voice was steady, but she could hear something underneath it, a careful intention, something being offered. She looked at him. "I'd like to take you to supper," he said. "Not as a courtesy, not because you're new here or because you teach Billy, because I would like your company specifically, and I've been meaning to say so for a while and I keep finding reasons not to, which I've run out of patience with." Irene considered this. The last of the sunset was burning in the western sky, and the cottonwood trees were whispering to themselves in the evening breeze, and she thought about Clara saying it's not romantic, Irene, and she thought about how wrong Clara had been. "I would like that," she said. He looked at her with those silver-gray eyes, and the careful thing in his expression shifted, releasing something quieter and warmer underneath, and he smiled, not the half-smile she was used to, but a full one, genuine and unguarded. "Saturday evening," he said. "Saturday evening," she agreed. He came on Saturday with his hat brushed and his best shirt on, and a small bunch of wildflowers that he held out with the directness of a man who has decided to do something properly and is not going to be embarrassed about it. She took them and put them in a cup of water on her windowsill and was unreasonably pleased by this for the entire evening. They ate supper at the one decent restaurant in Dusty Creek, a place called Hannigan's that served beef and roasted vegetables and pie, and they talked for 3 hours the way people talk when the conversation keeps opening onto new ground. He told her about growing up in Colorado, his father's small ranch, his mother who had died when he was 16, the years he had spent working other men's ranches before he came to Texas and built his own. She told him about Tennessee, her parents, her years of teaching, the banker's son she had nearly married, which made him listen carefully without saying the obvious thing about how glad he was she hadn't. "Why did you answer the advertisement?" he asked. "George Hollis's advertisement." "What made you decide to come west?" She thought about it honestly. "I was tired of being careful," she said. "My whole life I'd done the sensible thing, stayed near home, made reasonable choices, waited. I wanted to do something that couldn't be taken back, something real." He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "Irene, you are the most deliberate person I have ever met, and I mean that as the highest compliment." She looked at him across the small table in the lamplight of Hannigan's restaurant and felt something settle in her chest, a kind of recognition. "You are not what I expected," she told him. "What did you expect?" "Honestly, less. I expected less." His mouth curved. "That's fair. This territory doesn't encourage optimism as a general rule." They walked back through the warm night with the stars overhead in that spectacular abundance that still startled her every time she looked up. More stars than Tennessee had ever shown her, the whole sky crowded with them. He walked beside her at a comfortable distance, not presuming, and when they reached the schoolhouse door he stopped. "May I take you out again?" he asked. "Yes," she said, simply and directly, because she was, as he had noted, a deliberate person. He smiled again, that full, unguarded smile, and touched his hat, and walked back toward where he had left his horse, and Irene went inside and stood in the dark for a moment, feeling like something enormous had just shifted in the world, quietly and irrevocably, the way the most important things always seem to shift. There were more evenings after that. Sunday afternoons riding out across the flat grassland around the ranch, because he had offered her a gentle mare named Copper to ride, and she had, it turned out, more nerve on horseback than he had expected, a fact that seemed to please him enormously. Evenings sitting on his porch when she came to collect Billy after he'd stayed late to help with some chore or another, the three of them eating supper together with an ease that felt more like a long-established habit than anything new. Billy was not unaware of what was happening between his uncle and his teacher, and he navigated it with the quiet dignity of a 12-year-old who has decided not to comment but is clearly pleased. He occasionally engineered small situations that brought them together, forgetting something at the school that he needed Nathan to retrieve, asking Irene questions about the ranch that required Nathan to answer, with a subtlety that was, Irene thought, rather impressive for his age. The town noticed too, of course. Small towns always notice, and Dusty Creek was no exception. Mrs. Poole made a pointed remark about spring arriving early, which made no meteorological sense in August but made perfect social sense. Mr. Birch told Nathan that Miss Redmond was a fine addition to the community, in a tone that implied he expected certain developments. Caleb Ford started treating Nathan with a new respect at school board meetings that Nathan found baffling until Hector Crane explained it. "He thinks you're courting the teacher and he doesn't want to be on her bad side," Hector said. "She intimidates him a little, in the best way." Nathan found this extremely satisfying. What Nathan found less satisfying was the situation that arrived in September in the form of a man named Conrad Bale, who rode into Dusty Creek with 3 companions and took up residence at the saloon for a week with a cheerful energy that made several of the older ranchers in the area uneasy. Conrad Bale was a land speculator. He represented a group of investors from Dallas who were interested in acquiring grazing land in the area, and his interest was not politely theoretical. He had already made offers on 2 of the smaller spreads north of town, and had been pushing at the borders of several other properties, including Nathan's, with the kind of aggressive friendliness that was harder to fight than open hostility, because it made you look unreasonable if you objected. The specific problem was a water source. There was a spring-fed creek that ran along the eastern edge of Nathan's property and fed into the grazing land used by several ranchers in the area, and Bale's investors wanted control of that water. Without it, several of the smaller ranches in the area would become untenable. With it, Bale's group could effectively control who stayed and who went. Nathan had been dealing with this situation with the steady, quiet determination that characterized everything he did, going through county records and land surveys and correspondence with a patience that was gradually shaping into something formidable. But it was wearing on him, and Irene could see it in the slight tightening around his eyes when it was mentioned, and the way he sometimes sat very still and distant in the evenings before he noticed her watching and came back. She had not pushed. He would tell her when he was ready. But one evening in late September, sitting on his porch after Billy had gone to bed, she set down her mending and said, "Tell me about the water situation." He looked at her. "It's not your problem." "No," she agreed calmly. "Tell me anyway," he told her. The whole tangled legal history of it, the surveys and the deed language and the county clerk's records that were incomplete, and the way Bale's lawyers had found a gap in the documentation and were working it carefully. She listened without interrupting. When he was done, she said, "You said the original land grant paperwork shows the creek as a natural boundary. Have you checked whether there's a corresponding record at the state level? Texas land grants from the period before you took possession sometimes have duplicate records in Austin." He stared at her. "My father was a school teacher," she said, "but before that he worked in a land surveyor's office for 8 years. I grew up listening to exactly this kind of conversation. Have you checked the state records?" There was a long pause, and then he said, "No, I haven't." "Then that might be worth doing." It was worth doing. It took 3 weeks, and a letter written with Irene's careful precision and Nathan's detailed knowledge of the relevant history, sent to the Texas General Land Office in Austin, and the response that came back in late October contained a copy of the original state survey record that showed, clearly and unambiguously, the creek and its immediate borders as part of the property Nathan had purchased. When Nathan showed Conrad Bale's lawyer the document, the man's objections deflated with the particular slow flatness of a balloon meeting a pin. Bale himself left Dusty Creek 2 weeks later. He was not gracious about it, but he left. The ranchers in the area were deeply grateful, and the story of how the new schoolteacher's knowledge had turned the situation spread through town with the particular speed that good stories travel in small communities. This resulted in a general elevation of Irene's status that she found somewhat embarrassing and Nathan found deeply gratifying. "You know," he said one evening with a look that was warm and amused, "I was managing that situation before you arrived." "You were," she agreed. Slowly. He laughed, and she thought, not for the first time, that she loved the sound of his laugh, unexpected and genuine, like water in a dry landscape. October in Dusty Creek was magnificent. The heat softened into something golden, and the light took on a clarity that made everything look precisely itself. The cottonwood trees turned yellow overnight, and the grassland rolled out in every direction under a sky so blue it seemed impossible. They were out riding one Saturday afternoon, just the two of them, across the open country east of the ranch, when Nathan pulled up his horse at the top of a long, shallow rise and sat looking out at the view for a moment. She pulled Copper up beside him and looked too. The land stretched to the horizon in every direction, vast and spare, and in this light, strangely beautiful. "Do you ever miss Tennessee?" he asked. She thought about it genuinely. "I miss the trees," she said, "and my sister, but I don't miss the life I had there. I hadn't realized how small it had gotten until I left it." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I want to say something to you, and I'm going to say it directly because that seems like the right way to do things with you." She looked at him. His expression was very open, stripped of the usual slight guardedness that he wore by habit. "I love you," he said. "I have for some time. I wanted to tell you clearly and without any hedging because you deserve that." The land spread out around them, and the October light lay golden on the grass, and Irene Redmond sat on her horse and felt the whole world reorganize itself around something true. "Nathan," she said, and then she stopped because there was too much to say and most of it could be said without words. She looked at him across the small distance between their horses with everything she felt showing plainly on her face, because he had given her honesty, and she was going to give him the same. "I love you too. I think I have since approximately the third week I was here, which is both more quickly and more thoroughly than I had any intention of." He reached across the space between them and took her hand, and they sat there for a while on that ridge in the October light, the horses patient and still around them, and nothing needed to be said because everything had been said, and the saying had been enough. The winter came on gradually, bringing cold nights and gray mornings and the comfortable rituals of a community that knew how to prepare for it. Irene settled deeper into her life in Dusty Creek, her school running smoothly, her routine established, her presence in the town no longer that of a newcomer but of someone who belonged there. She knew people's names and their histories, and they knew hers, or enough of it to understand her, and that was its own kind of home. Nathan came to town most days now, or she rode out to the ranch on the afternoons she didn't have school. The courtship had a quality of naturalness that still sometimes surprised her, that two people could fit together this well, this easily, as though the thing they were building had always been waiting to be built and only needed the right materials. Billy thrived. He had found his footing in school, made friends, come out of the careful shell that grief had built around him with a gradual, happy slowness. He still had hard days, days when some memory of his parents surfaced and he went quiet and far away. And on those days, Nathan was always there in the particular steady way that was his strongest quality, not fixing anything, just being present. Irene discovered in December that Billy had been quietly writing letters to his maternal grandmother back in Missouri, a correspondence that Nathan had gently encouraged but not pushed. She read one of these letters over Billy's shoulder at his invitation, and was moved by the maturity and honesty in it. A 12-year-old processing the biggest losses a person can have with a clarity that she suspected he had learned partly from his uncle, and partly from a school year spent being told that honest thinking mattered. Christmas came, and with it the town's annual celebration at the church, which involved an enormous quantity of food brought by everyone, a choir that was enthusiastic if not always accurate, and the exchange of small gifts. Irene gave Nathan a book of maps she had ordered from a printer in San Antonio, knowing his interest in geography, and he gave her a set of chalk and a small journal with a leather cover that had her initials tooled into it. They were quiet and careful about this exchange, standing to the side of the general festivity, and she held the journal with both hands and looked at him and said, "This is beautiful. "You're always writing things," he said. "You should have somewhere good to write them." She thought of the first thing she had written in Texas, that single pragmatic line about George Holly's and the extraordinary sky, and felt the distance between that Irene and this one with a sense of something like wonder. It was on New Year's Eve, 1878 giving way to 1879, that they were standing outside the church after the midnight celebration with the cold stars blazing overhead and the sounds of the town's celebration still going on around them, that Nathan said, "I want to ask you something." She looked at him. His breath misted in the cold air, and his expression was that of a man who has made a decision and is at peace with it. "Will you marry me?" he said. "I know you came here under difficult circumstances, and I know you've built a life that's your own, and I'm not asking you to give anything up. I'm asking if you want to build something more, with me, and with Billy." Irene Redmond stood under the New Year's sky in Dusty Creek, Texas, in the last moments of 1878, and she thought about the woman who had climbed off a stagecoach 8 months ago with a leather trunk and a carpetbag and a fiancé who was already dead, and she thought about what it meant to come west to do something that couldn't be taken back. "Yes," she said, "with everything in me, yes." He took her face in his hands and kissed her, gently, and with a conviction that was entirely characteristic of him. And somewhere nearby someone set off a string of firecrackers that startled them apart laughing, and Delia Crane's voice could be heard from across the street, saying something that sounded very much like, "Finally." And the new year arrived with cold stars and firecracker smoke, and Irene Redmond's heart so full she could not have contained another drop of anything. They were married in March of 1879, in the little church with the crooked steeple, on a day when the first suggestion of spring was softening the air. Irene wore a dress of deep blue wool that Delia had helped her make, and she carried a small bouquet of early wildflowers that Nathan's housekeeper, a quiet Apache woman named Rosa who had worked at the ranch for 3 years, had gathered from the creek bottom at first light. Rosa's presence at the ranch was something Irene had learned about gradually, along with the complicated realities of life on the frontier that involved the constant tension between the settlers moving through and the people who had been there long before them. Rosa was a woman of perhaps 35 who had been separated from her people during a period of forced displacement years earlier and had eventually found work at the Thatcher Ranch, where Nathan had treated her with the straightforward respect he extended to anyone who worked hard and meant well. She had her own quarters, her own wages, her own dignity within the household, and she and Irene had developed over the winter a careful, genuine friendship built on mutual respect and a shared appreciation for directness. The history of what had happened to Rosa's people was not something Irene could undo or make right, and she did not pretend otherwise. But she could treat Rosa as what she was, a capable, intelligent woman with her own history and value, and this she did, and Rosa received it with a grace that Irene deeply admired. The wedding was attended by most of Dusty Creek, which was the kind of thing that happened in small frontier communities where people's lives were genuinely bound together. Caleb Ford gave a small speech that was surprisingly moving. Hector Crane cried openly and without embarrassment. Billy stood up beside Nathan as his witness, wearing a clean shirt that was slightly too large and an expression of such concentrated happiness that several people had to look away for a moment. Irene stood at the altar and looked at Nathan, at his clear gray eyes and his steady hands and the particular quality of attention he gave to everything that mattered to him. And she felt the absolute rightness of the thing they were doing settle through her like water settling into dry ground. The minister performed the ceremony with the slightly overwrought emotion of a man who genuinely loved what he did, and when Nathan said, "I will," it was in that low, even voice that carried in the quiet church without effort. And when Irene said the same words, she said them the way she did everything important, clearly and without hedging, with complete conviction. They were married. Irene Redmond became Irene Thatcher, though she kept using Redmond at the school because the children were used to it and change was disruptive, and she was a practical woman. The life they built together over the following years was not a simple one, because life on the frontier was never simple, but it was rich and full and shot through with a happiness that neither of them had been entirely certain they would find. The ranch grew. Nathan added land and cattle with the steady, patient strategy he brought to everything, not gambling, not overreaching, building carefully and solidly. Irene continued teaching, because the school needed her and because she loved it, and because Nathan had never for a moment suggested that marriage should mean she stopped being herself. This was, she thought, the most important thing about him, that he understood she was a whole person and wanted her to remain one. In the fall of 1879, Irene told Nathan she was expecting a child, and he was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, in a voice that was rougher than usual, "Are you well? Are you feeling all right?" "I'm quite well," she said, "tired but well." He took her hands in both of his in the careful way he had with things that mattered and said, "I am very glad." And it was the simplest possible thing, and it was exactly right. Their son was born in the spring of 1880, a healthy, loud, dark-haired boy whom they named James after Nathan's father, though Billy immediately and permanently began calling him Jamie, and the name stuck before the official one had much chance to establish itself. Jamie Thatcher arrived in the world with strong opinions about noise and feeding schedules, and the general inadequacy of anyone who was not his mother, which he expressed at considerable volume. Irene, who had always been capable and measured in every situation, found herself equally capable and measured in this one, nursing and soothing and managing with the same focused competence she brought to everything, while Nathan, who had not been a demonstrative man by nature, revealed himself to be a father of extraordinary tenderness, capable of sitting with a sleeping infant for an unreasonable amount of time with an expression of uncomplicated wonder. Billy was 13 when Jamie was born and behaved, after an initial period of what Irene suspected was some anxiety about his place in the household, exactly as she had hoped he would, with genuine affection and the dignity of an older cousin or something like a brother. He helped without being asked, made ridiculous faces to produce Jamie's first laughs, and brought the baby small offerings from the natural world, a smooth stone, a particularly interesting stick, a feather that might have been an eagle's, with the seriousness of someone who understood that gifts between people mattered. The school year of 1880 was the best Irene had taught. She had 14 students now, with the town growing, and she had developed a program that she was genuinely proud of, rigorous and warm in equal measure. Several of her earliest students were reading well above their grade level, and one, a girl named Margaret Birch, the youngest child of the general store owner and sister to the infamous cat branding incident, had a mathematical ability that Irene was actively working to develop and had written to a college in San Antonio about, making the case with characteristic precision. Caleb Ford told her once that year that the school had never been better. She thanked him without much fuss and went back to work. There were difficulties too, because there always were. In the summer of 1880, there was a drought that hit the area hard, drying up some of the smaller water sources and forcing difficult decisions about cattle and grazing. Nathan managed it with the same steady intelligence he brought to everything, selling off some of the herd earlier than planned, moving cattle to the eastern pastures where the spring creek still ran, making choices that hurt in the short term but preserved the operation's future. There were nights during that summer when she found him sitting on the porch after everyone was asleep, looking out at the dry land with the particular stillness of someone carrying a heavy thing quietly. She would sit with him, and they would not always talk, because sometimes what was needed was not conversation, but simply the knowledge that someone was there. "We'll be all right," she said one of those nights, not with false cheerfulness but with the honest conviction of someone who has done the calculation and is confident in the result. He looked at her in the moonlight. "I know," he said. "I know it up here." He touched his temple, I'm still working on knowing it down here." He touched his chest. She leaned against him and he put his arm around her and they sat in the warm dark while the dry wind moved through the grass and Jamie slept inside, and somewhere a coyote made its wavering call to the moon. The drought broke in September. It broke the way droughts on the Texas plain broke, with tremendous storms that came in from the west all at once, lightning walking across the horizon and rain falling in sheets. And Irene stood in the doorway of the farmhouse with Jamie on her hip and watched it come, and felt something release in her chest that had been held tight since May. Nathan came inside soaking wet from checking the stock, and she handed him a towel, and he stood dripping in the kitchen with a wide, uncomplicated grin that was the most purely happy she had seen him in months. "There it is," he said. "There it is," she agreed. The years that followed were full. Billy grew into himself with the particular satisfying progression of a young person who has been given good soil, shooting up past Nathan's shoulder at 16, and becoming someone who was recognizably his own, thoughtful and steady, and more willing to laugh than he had been when he arrived. He developed a serious interest in horses, specifically in breeding and training, and Nathan began teaching him the details of that work with the patience and precision he brought to everything. At 17, Billy went back to Missouri for the first time to visit his grandmother, Mrs. Eliza Marsh, and came back with a complicated expression, and a letter from Mrs. Marsh addressed to Nathan and Irene that thanked them for what they had done for her grandson in language that was restrained, and therefore all the more moving. Jamie grew out of babyhood into a sturdy, curious child who approached the world with the particular unfrightened openness of someone who has always known they were loved. He was everywhere, into everything, bringing home frogs and interesting rocks, and once an entire hornet's nest that had fallen from a tree, which he had helpfully picked up to show his mother. He had Irene's green eyes and Nathan's dark hair and both their stubbornness, which manifested as a cheerful immovability that was both maddening and charming. Irene taught him to read early, and he took to books the way some children take to water, immediately and without reservation, going through everything she had and asking for more with an insistence that she found professionally satisfying. By the time he was 5, he was reading to Billy's old horse in the stable, which the horse appeared to find acceptable. In the spring of 1882, Irene found out she was expecting again. She was 28 years old and the ranch was well established, and the school was running beautifully, and she told Nathan over supper on a Tuesday evening with the directness that characterized all their most important conversations. He looked at her across the table where Jamie was busy attempting to balance a spoon on his nose and Billy was pretending not to listen, and his expression did the thing she loved, that quiet opening into warmth. "Another spring baby," he said. "It appears so." "Jamie, you're going to have a brother or a sister." Jamie put the spoon down and regarded his father with the gravity of someone receiving important information. "Which one?" he asked. "We don't know yet," Nathan said. Jamie thought about this. "I want a brother," he said. "Brothers are better." "You have approximately no information on which to base that opinion," Irene said. "I know," Jamie agreed seriously. "But I still want one." He got a sister. She arrived in the winter of 1882, the day before Christmas, with the timing that Irene had not entirely predicted, but that Rosa, who had a gift for this kind of knowledge, had said all along would be close to the holiday. She was born healthy and opinionated, and regarding the world with the watchful gray eyes she had clearly inherited from her father. They named her Clara, after Irene's sister in Tennessee, and wrote Clara Redmond a letter that arrived in Knoxville in January 1883 and produced, according to the return letter, tears of what was described as completely unexpected joy. "Please tell Nathan I think highly of him." Jamie's reaction to the arrival of a sister was complex. He spent a day being very pointedly unimpressed, and then was found the following morning sitting very carefully beside Irene on the bed, looking at the sleeping baby with an expression of absolute and speechless wonder that was so like his father's face when Jamie himself had been born that Irene had to look away to compose herself. "She's small," Jamie observed. "You were smaller," Irene said. He considered this. "Was I this wrinkled?" "More so." He nodded with the thoughtful acceptance of new information, and then, with great seriousness, reached out one finger and touched the baby's hand. Little Clara's hand closed around it with the reflexive grip of the very new, and Jamie looked up at Irene with something on his face that was somewhere between amazement and alarm. "She's holding on," he said. "She knows you're her brother," Irene said. He was, from that moment, her devoted defender for the rest of his life. The school year of 1883 was Irene's fifth in Dusty Creek, and the spring term brought with it a small ceremony that Caleb Ford had arranged to mark the school's expansion, a new second room being added to accommodate the growing number of students. The town had grown considerably in 5 years, new families arriving regularly, drawn by the railroad that had come through in 1881 and changed the area's economic character substantially. At the ceremony, which was attended by most of the town and featured a brief speech by Caleb Ford and a rather longer one by a man from the county seat who had driven out for the occasion, Irene stood in the warm spring sunshine with Clara on her hip and Jamie holding her hand and Nathan beside her, and looked at the school she had built, not just the building but the community around it, the children she had taught, the skills she had given them. The conversations that had started here and gone out into the world in ways she would never fully know. Delia Crane appeared at her elbow, as she reliably did at all important moments. "Do you remember," Delia said, "arriving on that stage 5 years ago with your one trunk and your carpetbag and no husband and no plan?" "I remember," Irene said, "and now look." Delia gestured broadly and without specificity at the entire scene. "You stubborn, wonderful woman," Irene laughed. "I had help." "Everyone has help," Delia said firmly. "What matters is what you do with it, and what you've done with it, Irene Thatcher, is considerable." Nathan heard this exchange from where he was standing a few steps away and turned to give Irene a look that contained, in the way their looks had developed over 5 years, a great many things at once: agreement and pride and amusement and love, deep and settled and entirely sure of itself. She met his look with one of her own that meant, "I know. And I know you know. And that is everything." The county official finished his longer speech, and there was applause and Caleb Ford looked relieved, and Jamie let go of Irene's hand and ran to find his friends and Clara, who had been patient for approximately as long as a 2-year-old could be expected to be, announced her opinions about the situation at some volume. Irene settled Clara on her other hip and Nathan materialized beside her and took Clara from her arms with the practiced ease of a man who has been doing this for several months. And Clara immediately grabbed his collar and said, "Papa," with the absolute authority of someone who knows exactly what they have. And Nathan looked at her with that expression, the helpless, total love of a parent. And Irene watched it and felt the kind of happiness that lives in the ordinary moments. In the warm spring day and the small child and the man beside her, the happiness that doesn't announce itself but simply is, steady as water, steady as stone. Rosa came to stand with them, as she often did at public events, still carrying a particular self-containment, but no longer the wariness of someone uncertain of their welcome. Over 5 years, she had become woven into the fabric of the Thatcher household in a way that was difficult to articulate but easy to feel. She had taught Irene things about the land that no book had ever told her, about plants and water and weather, and the deep history of the place that predated every white rancher by generations. And Irene had listened and learned and done what she could, which was not enough to repair history, but was more than nothing. Rosa looked at the school and then at Irene and said simply, "Good work." From Rosa, that was a speech. The summer of 1883 brought Billy's return from a horse-buying trip to San Antonio, which he had undertaken on behalf of the ranch with the competence of someone who had been doing this work for years. He came back with 4 excellent horses, a deal that Nathan pronounced very good, and a faintly distracted expression that Irene noticed immediately. She waited a week and then asked him about it while they were both in the kitchen after supper, Nathan outside with Jamie, Clara already asleep. Billy was quiet for a moment and then said, "There was a woman in San Antonio." Irene set down her dish towel. "Tell me." Her name was Lucy Alcott. She was 20, the daughter of a rancher who ran cattle between San Antonio and Austin, and she had been at the stockyards with her father when Billy had been there for the horse sale. They had talked for 2 days, and Billy had left with her address written on a piece of paper that he had clearly been treating with extreme care, given its current pristine condition. "She's intelligent and kind, and she knows horses nearly as well as I do," Billy said with the slightly dazed quality of someone reporting a remarkable discovery. "She didn't find that odd. She just told me about her father's breeding program." Irene smiled. "Have you written to her?" "I've written 3 letters and torn them all up. Write the 4th one and send it." He looked at her. "What if she doesn't write back?" "Then you'll know," Irene said simply. "But she gave you her address, Billy. She wants you to write." He wrote the letter. Lucy Alcott wrote back within 2 weeks, a letter of considerable length and quality that Billy read 3 times at the kitchen table, with an expression that reminded Irene strongly of his uncle sitting on the porch in the moonlight on a night some years ago, looking at something he was not quite sure he was allowed to want yet. He went back to San Antonio in October, ostensibly for another horse business matter that everyone in the household understood to be largely incidental. He came back 10 days later looking like a man who has had something settled and is at peace with it, and when Irene asked him how the trip had gone, he said, "Very well. Lucy will be visiting her cousin in Abilene in the spring. I told her I'd come to Abilene." Nathan, who was sitting by the fire pretending to read, did not look up. "Smart trip," he said. Billy looked at him, and there was something between them, the comfortable, layered understanding between 2 people who have been through things together. And Billy said, "I had a good example to follow." And Nathan did look up then, and they regarded each other with the quiet dignity of men who are not going to make a scene about the emotional weight of this moment, but feel it completely nonetheless. Irene watched this from the doorway and thought that one of the best things she had found in the West was this family that she had walked into by accident and love and stubbornness, this particular collection of people who had become, by 5 years of daily, ordinary life, the most important people in the world to her. Spring came again, as spring always did, without asking permission and without apology. 1884 arrived with warmth and the smell of new grass, and Jamie, at 4 years old, becoming absolutely convinced that he could train horses and attempting to demonstrate this conviction on the most patient animal in the stable, an elderly gray mare named Biscuit, who tolerated his attentions with the vast equanimity of something that had been patient for many years. Irene watched from the fence as Jamie explained, at considerable length, what he expected of Biscuit, and Biscuit regarded him with one large liquid eye and chewed thoughtfully, and Nathan stood beside Irene with his arms on the fence rail, and his hat pushed back, and the afternoon light on his face. "He's going to be a horseman," Nathan said. "He's going to be something," Irene agreed. She reached over and took his hand on the fence rail, her smaller hand over his larger one, and they stood there in the spring warmth watching their son negotiate with a horse and their daughter in the house sleeping in the bright patch of sunlight that came through the kitchen window in the afternoon. And the whole of it, the whole accumulated weight of 5 years of ordinary love, was present in that moment. "I want to tell you something," Nathan said without looking at her, his voice quiet. "Tell me. I think about the morning I almost walked you over outside Birch's store, with the horse. I think about what it would have been like if I'd taken a different route into town that day." She looked at him sideways. His expression was that particular serious, open one that meant he was saying exactly what he meant. "I think about that too sometimes," she said. I'm very glad I took that route. She squeezed his hand. I'm very glad George Holly's put an advertisement in a Tennessee newspaper. He looked at her then, and there was something in his face that was everything she had come to know in 5 years, the steady love and the dry humor and the deep certainty, and he said, "Irene, thank you for staying." She looked back at him with the full frankness that she had always preferred to any kind of circumlocution. "This is home," she said. "There was never any question of anything else." He turned his hand over under hers and held it properly, and Jamie, oblivious to this exchange, finally got Biscuit to walk a few steps in the direction he wanted and turned around with an expression of triumphant joy so enormous and uncomplicated that it made them both laugh, the kind of helpless laugh that comes from love expressed through delight. The evening settled gently over the Thatcher ranch, the way evenings did in this country, with the light going long and gold across the grass and the shadows stretching east and the first few stars appearing in the deepening blue overhead. Rosa was cooking supper. The smell of it drifted out through the open kitchen door. Clara had woken from her nap and could be heard talking to herself with the conversational fluency of someone who has decided that words are very interesting and wants to use all of them. Irene and Nathan walked back toward the house hand in hand, while Jamie ran ahead calling to Clara through the door, and the ranch sat solid and real around them, the result of years of work and choice and love, and it was exactly what Irene had come west to build. Something real, something that couldn't be taken back. She had found it and more than it, and the finding had remade her in ways she had not expected and was entirely grateful for. The years that followed continued to be full in that good, real way that has nothing to do with ease and everything to do with meaning. Billy made his trip to Abilene in the spring of 1884, and his courtship of Lucy Alcott proceeded with the careful steadiness that was characteristic of him. They were married in the fall of 1885, a wedding in San Antonio attended by Lucy's large family and by Nathan and Irene and the children. And Billy, who had been 12 years old and red-eyed and trying so hard to be brave the first time Irene had seen him, stood at that altar with the confident bearing of a young man who has found his ground. Irene cried at the wedding, quietly and without apology, because she had learned that crying at weddings was appropriate, and she had spent too many years being unnecessarily composed. Nathan gave her his handkerchief and said nothing, which was the right thing to do. Lucy Alcott Thatcher was exactly what Billy had said she was, intelligent and capable and warm and easy with horses, and she and Irene liked each other immediately and completely, with the directness of two women who do not have time for performance. She fit into the family with the naturalness of something that belongs there, and the first Christmas she spent at the ranch, she and Irene stayed up late at the kitchen table long after everyone else had gone to bed, talking about everything. And Irene thought that family, the real kind, the built kind, had a generosity to it that never seemed to run out, that it simply expanded to hold whoever was brought into it with love. Billy and Lucy settled on a parcel of land that Nathan helped them secure, adjacent to his own, and built a modest house that Lucy immediately began making comfortable, and Billy immediately began building on. They were good neighbors and good family and good friends, and their first child was born in the spring of 1887, a boy they named Thomas, who arrived with the same healthy outraged volume that seemed to characterize Thatcher children generally. Jamie at 7 was fascinated by this new baby in the way that older children are fascinated by smaller children, with a proprietorial protectiveness that he did not bother to hide. He informed Thomas from the earliest possible age about horses and grass and weather and the correct way to do various things, and Thomas, when he was old enough to have opinions, ignored most of this but seemed to find Jamie's company genuinely essential, which Jamie accepted as his due. Clara at 5 was already showing signs of the particular quality of intelligence that made Irene quietly triumphant, the same focused curiosity, the same appetite for books, the same way of asking questions that went straight to the heart of things. She came to school with Irene sometimes, sitting in the back and watching with enormous eyes while her mother taught, and Nathan had mentioned once with the wry smile that meant he was genuinely pleased that Clara had already begun holding court among the ranch hand's children and explaining things to them in a manner she had clearly learned from somewhere. "I wonder where," Nathan had said, not wondering at all. The school in Dusty Creek had grown to 30 students by 1886, and Irene now had an assistant, a young woman named Helen Parks who had come west from Ohio with her family and who had enough education and genuine enthusiasm to be useful. Irene taught Helen the way she taught everyone, with high expectation and genuine support, and Helen turned out to be gifted with the younger children in particular, with a patience and a warmth that freed Irene to focus more on the older students. Caleb Ford, who had been on the school board for as long as anyone could remember and who had become, over the years, something of a friend, told Irene in 1886 that the county superintendent had cited the Dusty Creek School as one of the best in the region. She thanked him, and then she went home and told Nathan, and then she allowed herself to feel the full satisfaction of it, because some things deserve to be properly felt. Nathan listened and then said, "Does this surprise you?" She thought about it. "No," she said honestly, "but it's good to have it confirmed." He smiled in that way that meant he agreed with her and also found her slightly wonderful. She felt precisely the same way about him and told him so, and this led to one of the comfortable, private conversations that marriage makes possible after years of knowing someone, the kind where everything is already understood and can simply be said. The town of Dusty Creek continued to change and grow around them. The railroad brought new people and new commerce, and the edge of the frontier pushed further west, so that by the late 1880s Dusty Creek felt less like a raw outpost and more like an established community with its own character and history. There were 2 stores now, a doctor, a newspaper that had started up in 1884 and been running ever since, and a town council that met regularly and argued with commitment about everything from road maintenance to the price of water rights. Nathan served 1 term on the town council at the urging of several people, and with the resigned acceptance of someone who has decided that civic participation is worth the inconvenience. He was a good council member, careful and fair, and not interested in the particular varieties of ego that made civic life difficult in small communities. He served his term and did not serve another, and the town respected him for it. Rosa had, over the years, become less of an employee in the household and more of what she actually was, a person who had chosen to make her life in this place and who had made it on her own terms, with her own knowledge and her own dignity. She had occasionally gone back to visit the remains of her people's community when that was possible, and had come back each time with something in her expression that was complicated and not fully readable, and Irene had learned to sit with that complexity without trying to resolve it, because some things are not hers to resolve. Rosa had taught Clara the names of plants in her language alongside Irene's English names, and Clara had learned both with equal earnestness and used them interchangeably in a way that Rosa seemed to find acceptable. This small thing mattered, Irene thought. It was not nearly enough in the face of what had been taken, but it was something. In the fall of 1887, Irene received a letter from her sister Clara in Tennessee that contained news. Their parents' health was declining, and Clara thought it might be a good time for Irene to visit if she could manage it. Irene showed the letter to Nathan, and he read it and said, without hesitation, "Go, take Jamie and little Clara. I'll manage here and you need to see your family." She looked at him. "That's a long trip." "It is," he agreed. "And you haven't seen your parents in 9 years. Go." She went. She took the children and spent 3 weeks in Tennessee, and her parents were older and slower but well enough. And her sister Clara cried at the sight of the children, with the abandon of someone who has missed their sibling more than they had admitted even to themselves. Little Clara Thatcher met her namesake aunt and immediately recognized a kindred spirit, and the two of them were inseparable for the entire visit, which left Irene and her sister plenty of time to talk in the long evenings the way they hadn't talked since they were girls sharing a room. "Are you happy?" Clara asked, on the last evening, sitting on the porch of their childhood home. Irene thought about the question seriously, the way she took all questions seriously. "Yes," she said. "Not in the way I imagined happiness when I was young, not the soft, uncomplicated kind, but in the real way, the kind that's earned." Clara nodded. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "I always worried about you going so far away." "I know," Irene said. "I know you did, but it was the right thing. It turned out to be exactly the right thing." She came back to Texas in October to find the ranch exactly as she had left it, well managed and solid, and Nathan standing at the gate when the wagon from town came up the road, having apparently been watching for them, with an expression on his face when he saw her that was so open and glad, and entirely unconcealed that she thought it was possibly the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She got down from the wagon and walked to him, and he put his arms around her without ceremony and held on, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and breathed, and that was home. The children tumbled down from the wagon behind her, and Jamie went immediately to the stable to check on his horses, and Clara ran to find Rosa with something in her pocket that she had brought from Tennessee, and Nathan and Irene stood in the October afternoon holding onto each other with the simple completeness of people who know exactly what they have. "I missed you," he said into her hair. "I know," she said. "I could tell from 20 miles away." He laughed, and she felt it in his chest, and it was everything she had known it would be when she came back to it, familiar and warm and entirely irreplaceable. The years settled into each other with the rhythm of lives well lived. Jamie grew into a young man with a genuine talent for horses that rivaled Billy's own, and at 15, he was already working with Nathan in the full sense, not as an apprentice, but as a partner, with the easy communication between them of two people who have done the same work together for so long that words are often unnecessary. He was quiet like his father, but with Irene's sharpness underneath it, and he had the habit, when he thought no one was watching, of reading anything he could find with the same voracious appetite he had displayed since childhood. Clara grew into the force of nature that Irene had suspected she would become from approximately the age of 3. She was clever and direct and opinionated and entirely sure of herself, in ways that Irene had worked her whole life to become, and simply was from birth. She sat in her mother's school and absorbed everything, and asked the questions that the other students hadn't thought to ask, and generally made Helen Parks's job considerably more interesting. "Your daughter," Helen told Irene one afternoon with a particular expression, "is 11 years old and she argued with me about geography for 45 minutes today and she was right." "I know," Irene said. "I'm sorry." "Don't be," Helen said. "It was the best conversation I've had all month." In the spring of 1890, Irene and Nathan rode out one Sunday afternoon to the ridge east of the ranch, where they had ridden that long-ago October day in 1878 when he had told her he loved her. The same ridge with the same long view, though the years had changed the land around it in ways both visible and invisible. They sat their horses at the top and looked out at the same horizon, and the grass moved in the same wind, and the sky was the same impossible blue. 12 years, Irene said. 11 years married, Nathan said, both a long time. He looked at her, she looked at him. They had aged, both of them, the way people age when they have spent their years doing real work under open sky, lines at the corners of the eyes, a steadiness in the face that comes from having navigated things. But his eyes were the same silver gray they had always been, clear and direct and full of the quiet attention that was, she thought, the thing about him she loved most. "I would do all of it again," he said. "Every bit of it," she agreed. "Even the hard parts." "Especially the hard parts," he said. "The hard parts made the rest of it matter." She reached out her hand across the space between their horses and he took it, and they sat on the ridge in the spring afternoon, with the whole of Texas stretching away from them in every direction, and the life they had built together was solid and real and entirely their own. Jamie and Clara would be home for supper. Billy and Lucy and Thomas were coming over on Sunday. Rosa had started something that smelled extraordinarily good in the kitchen before they left. The school had its spring review next week, and Irene had 17 students who were going to stand up and show the town what they had learned, and she was quietly proud of every one of them. This was the life that Irene Redmond had come west to find, not the life she had planned, which had been practical and sensible, and would have been entirely without this man and this sky and these children and this feeling of having landed exactly where you were supposed to be. She had come here with a leather trunk and a carpetbag to marry a man she had never met, and instead she had found something she had not known to look for. She had found a home that was also an adventure, a love that was also a partnership, a family that was also a community. And every morning she woke up in this place and saw the Texas sky do something extraordinary with the light. She thought of that first evening when she had sat in a narrow room at a boarding house with no plan and written in her journal that the sky was extraordinary. She had been right about the sky. She had been right about all of it. Nathan turned to look at her one more time before they turned their horses back toward home, and what was in his face was the whole of it, all 11 years of their marriage and all the years before that and all the years still to come. And she held it the way she held everything that mattered to her, carefully, completely, and without any intention of letting go. "Ready?" he said. "Always," she said. They rode home together under the wide Texas sky, into the life they had made, which was full and real and entirely enough. And the sun went down behind them in the west in that spectacular blaze of orange and red that had startled her on her very first evening in this territory. And it was still the most beautiful thing she had ever seen, except possibly for the man riding beside her, who had walked around the corner of a general store one ordinary morning and changed the entire direction of everything. She had not come west for romance. She had found it anyway in the best possible way, not as something that happened to her but as something she had chosen, deliberately and with full knowledge, the way she did everything that truly mattered. And it was, in every sense, more than enough.